Hey, Drew, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hey guys, let's wait for 1 more minute and then let's get started. All right, let's get started. So we have two agenda items today. One, controller service needs to be optional. I saw a bunch of discussion there. So James, do you want to give a kind of overview of what's the discussion?
Sure. Just give me a second to pull that up. Yeah, so I spent a little time thinking about this today, and I wrote maybe a comment that was too long on the ticket. I guess the idea is that, there's a couple different ways that we can go in terms of how we approach this API. We can make things. We could put all of our RPCs into one monolithic service. We could head down the path that we're currently on, which is like specialized services, for related RPCs, and then we could go even further along that path and get out into like the world of optional specialized services or something. So, I guess the use case that was driving this was NFS, because they don't have any node operations. And I was thinking about the NFS use case, and what we've discussed in the past is that validate is important for use cases like NFS because there's no create, and the user is going to be entering this data in parameters for connecting to an NFS share, and we needed a way to like validate that those parameters were okay for a CO to validate that, right? Otherwise, you don't find out that they break until you actually try to execute like a node publish or something. So we had this validate volume capabilities call in there, and it was a non-optional call.
Yeah, so James, one question there is, in order to call validate, do you need list?
Why do you need list?
Because you need to get the volume ID somehow, right? Or you just construct the volume ID.
Well, this was the thing, right? So for like NFS, you wouldn't have create delete, you wouldn't necessarily even have list, right? You have like an expert user that knows how to craft, the volume parameters for the NFS share they want to connect to, because they're reading the plugin docs, and the plugin docs say, you should create volumes like this, right? With these capabilities or whatever it is. So
yeah, I remember. Okay.
We had this validate call in there so that plugins could actually validate that information was accurate or at least acceptable before you get to the point where you start scheduling workloads and placing workloads on nodes and trying to use these volumes. So
I see. So the problem is like a validate volume capability right now is in controller service, but to support a case where NFS, where you don't want a controller service to run in a centralized location, what essentially means is either you put the validate volume capability into a different service, or you merge that into like identity service, which has to have, which has to present on the node.
Well, you could merge it with identity service. You could create like a new service called validation service. You can make it an optional controller service, but then you're still implementing controller, which doesn't really solve the problem. So I was thinking, well, let's say it was part of identity, right? So if it was part of identity, or even if it was like its own standalone service, and you end up with this plugin that has no controller, and you just have all these plugin instances running on all these different worker nodes in your cluster, is it okay then if you need to validate something that you just make a call out to any worker node in your cluster to say, hey, go check out this volume capability and let me know if it's okay. I'm pretty sure there's an NFS plugin running on this worker node over here, so I'm going to ask it to do the validation for me. Does that even make sense?
I would shy away from that. I think there's the reason we're having difficulty here is that there's a very deep coupling between validate volume capability and the controller, the other controller methods. In particular, I would go as far as to arguing that if a particular volume plugin doesn't implement the controller service, it shouldn't get the benefit of a validate volume capability. And for the NFS case, for example, I would argue, okay, if you want to implement a very dumb NFS plugin that has no controller, then you don't get this ability. But if you do implement a controller service, you get, for example, dynamic provisioning through the create volume call, and you get fast volume validation through validate volume capability.
So maybe you can help me understand, Saad, what's the advantage to the advantages that you can write a quick dumb plugin without having to implement controller?
It just reduces the overhead for just, I want to kick the tires, I want to understand how to write a volume plugin. I don't want to write a control plane for my storage system. So like NFS doesn't have a control plane that ships with it that's easy to configure. So for that case, all I want to do is just mount and unmount. You can imagine volume plugins in the future doing things like injection of secret data or some ephemeral volume like that, where it doesn't care about the control plane aspect of it at all. So I should be able to implement just the basic mount unmount or what we call publish unpublish and call it a day.
So maybe you can speak a little more about these other use cases, because I'm trying to understand like the usefulness of supporting plugins that are written in a way that they're not robust enough that they can even validate, express that they can validate input to a CO, right? So like what's the utility of a plugin like that?
It would be moving the overhead to the consumer. So imagine something like a plugin that will inject identity into a pod, right? For something like that, as far as the volume plugin writer for a plugin like that is concerned, they just want to hook into the mount and unmount calls and be able to inject some data into this pod. And so as far as the consumer is concerned, all they have to do is specify this volume plugin and that data shows up. There is no need for provisioning. There's no need for attaching globally or at the control plane level. All they need is just a simple mount and unmount hook, basically.
But Sad, I think like if you consider like non-mount, like if you don't know this plugin is actually NFS, because like you cannot tell by the name itself, like how do you know that the plugin itself support like a block or mount? Like you don't even have a way to validate that.
No, I get that. So if basically what happens in that case is, it's an invalid configuration and you're going to have to fail late. When we go to do node publish, then the volume plugin is going to say, sorry, bub, I don't support that. And your workload remains pending. I think that's okay for the set of volume plugins that don't want to have to implement this. I think the vast majority of volume plugins will implement a controller, and for them, they will get the ability to get early validation. But we shouldn't force it on all volume plugins.
Okay. So what I'm hearing now is that instead of being something necessarily for simple, stupid plugins, this is something for special case, very specialized plugins that are written specifically with the intent of not needing validation because there's some expertly written code that's going to only generate valid things 99.9% of the time.
Yeah, possibly. And then the use case there, I haven't thought through it much, but my understanding is for things like injection of some sort of ephemeral data into a volume, where all they want is a hook into mount and unmount, and they'll take care of the rest. We do this today with things like secret volume injection, config map injection. And in those cases, the only hooks that the plugin needs is mount and unmount, and the rest of it is taken care of by, in this case, the Kubernetes controllers, but you can imagine some external entity.
Okay. So yeah, so that makes more sense to me. This use case makes more sense to me. And so in this case, you would just have the entire controller service as optional then.
Right.
Because there's no controller functionality whatsoever. Really, all you want to do is tap into the node lifecycle.
Yep.
Yeah.
Is validate volume capability right now optional, or it's mandatory right now?
It's mandatory.
Okay, so we need to change that to be like optional, maybe.
Well,
I guess it's mandatory in the controller service.
Yeah,
the service as a whole is optional.
Right. That's kind of the direction that my thinking was going, is that maybe we just make the controller service optional. So we still make it like a should, right? Like like 99% of the time you should be writing a controller or something, and then it's these special case situations where maybe you don't actually do that.
Don't we have a separate item for that? I thought there was somebody raised an issue for that already. I'm misremembering.
Isn't this the issue we're talking about, 162, or is it something else?
Oh, yes, it is. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I joined late, so.
No worries.
Just tardy, not completely. Anyway, yeah, one thing I was wondering about this one is, right now we have this flow where we have an ID and attributes and whatnot that come from creating a volume, and it's assumed that you're going to have a plugin generated volume ID by the time you get to node publish. If we're saying the controller is optional, that means that the volume ID, I guess you would either leave it out or it would be CO generated just that one time.
I think it's user generated volume ID. So somehow they know what the ID and attributes the plugin is expecting, and then specify those things. For example, NFS, I expect the volume ID is like the path of the NFS share, and then attributes some like additional NFS parameters that's documented somewhere that a user has to specify, and that CO just dumbly pass that information to the plugin.
Yeah, I mean, we have that hole in the spec right now already. So it's that particular aspect of it's not something that's new. I guess what's new is that we're proposing taking away a CO's ability to validate an ID that a user or some code other than the plugin generates. For
Right.
Special cases where we're saying, well, there's this expertly written code over here where the author took extra care to make sure that they're going to generate IDs in a way that this plugin wants to consume them because it's for special purpose integration with specific, sub features of a CO or something, right?
So one thing I realized that we probably need to expose the information to the CO so that CO knows that this plugin has an implement controller service. I feel like this is more explicit compared to where like CO just calls some function and validate volume capability and then realize that, oh shit, it's unimplemented, and then stop doing that. I feel like making it more explicit sounds like a better approach if we want to support that.
Right. Yeah. So I was thinking, so if we want to make controller service optional, then we could add an RPC to the identity service or something that's like, some kind of identity capabilities call where.
Yeah, but that's kind of called out right in the first description, right? We would be moving get capabilities into the identity service.
Well, we should add an enum there because I don't think we have the enum for the controller service, the entire controller service. We should have
Sure.
There's a couple ways you could do it. I mean, you could move all your capabilities up there and just have be like a one-stop shop for like all the capabilities of all the services of all the plugins. Or you could fragment it and kind of keep capabilities for controller where they are now and keep capabilities for node where they are now. And then you just basically add like some kind of a service capability support for identity. So identity can at least tell you like what services are available. And then based on what services are there, you can query those services and figure out what are the capabilities of those services. You could kind of, split it along those lines too.
Yeah. I was thinking the former might be cleaner where we have, the latter, what you just mentioned, which was keep capabilities in both controller and node and then introduce a global capabilities in the identity, which basically just has controller as optional or not. But then I started thinking about some of the use cases, and I think capability are something where we want to be able to discover them regardless of whether the service is implemented or not. So I should be able to probe what the node or the controller to figure out whether it implements a create delete, for example, or the attach method. Like it should just be something that the plugin knows it supports or it doesn't support, and I should be able to probe any arbitrary endpoint. And so for that reason, I think I'm leaning towards just one global get capabilities in the identity service. that has everything inside it.
So that's interesting, right? So let's say you've got a plugin that you've got a plugin that ships in two pieces, right? Like one piece that runs on the controller and one piece that runs on all your different nodes. And let's say we do what you propose, where the identity service is providing you information about all the capabilities. If something can query the node, the plugin that's running on the node, and ask it about create delete, and that plugin says, yeah, I support create delete, but it can't tell you where to find the controller necessarily. Like there seems to be like a little bit of a disconnect. Like, yeah, I support
I think the difference is that in defining what exactly the capability is for. Is it the capability of this specific instance that is running, or this plugin as a whole entity? And if we argue that the capability is for the instance, then it would make sense to break up the capability calls per service. If we argue that capability is for the entire plugin, as far as the caller is concerned, they don't necessarily care about the capability of a particular instance, just what that plugin is capable for. If we go with that argument, then it would make sense to consolidate capabilities into just one place in identity.
Yeah, I think I like the fact that I like the idea of consolidating, because I think there are like some no capability is kind of related to controller capability. Like for example, published unpublished volume is related to get no ID, which is kind of something that it's already related. So I mean, merge these two sounds good to me. Just simplify the whole thing.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that other question is an interesting question. Like in multi-node deployments, what plugins are responsible for which roles, and who should I call if I want to do controller things? But I think that's all tangled up in the discovery and deployment. Like how, and we've punted on that. So, so I think we need to punt on the capabilities question too. So I agree. I think this would be nicer if it was all just one RPC.
Okay, so it sounds like we're kind of coalescing around this idea of moving all the capability stuff into identity. So you've got a one-stop shop, and you're not necessarily querying for the capability of the plugin instance.
It might help if we rename it to plugin capability, to just for clarification. That way, there's no it's obvious that this is not the capability of the particular instance, but rather the entire plugin as a whole.
I like that. I mean, that also gives us room to do like more like per instance capability if we want to do that later.
Yeah.
And right now we do have per instance capability. And are there any use cases that we know that we're killing by shifting gears and moving to like a more holistic plugin capability model versus a per instance model?
I think the primary use case was more around discovery of what a particular instance supports. But like Julian mentioned, that is more of a deployment and discovery issue, and that is handled outside of the spec today. And as far as Kubernetes is concerned, we know where which components are deployed where. So the folks who are deploying the plugins are responsible for ensuring that they're deployed in the correct places. They have to ensure that the thing that supports Node is deployed in the correct place, and when we probe it, we expect Node to be there, and vice versa for controller.
Hey, Brian, do you have an opinion on this? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
So I've always felt that a capability service is a little weird in general, just because basically we get this endless list of capabilities that will never, like every time we add a feature, we have to add another item to this list and always check for it. And so I don't have good thoughts about capability to begin with. Moving it into a single RPC seems better, because I do tend to think of a plugin as a whole unit and not node and controller. So, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Sounds like we have consensus. So, Sa, who's gonna send out a PR for this?
I think I took responsibility for sending out a PR. I'm just,
Oh, you are. Oh, yeah, yeah. I remember that. So, yeah.
and I'm happy to do it. So
Okay.
I just wanted to get some consensus on direction before I started making spec changes.
So I'm going to update the notes over here. The decisions that we made are: one, consolidate capabilities into a single plugin capability, call in the identity service. And then was there anything else that we resolved here?
Well, it sounds like maybe have a capability that would indicate which services are offered by the plugin.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense or no? Because we still have different services. So I'm just trying to think. So if you consolidate all your capabilities, you still don't know whether or not you can call validate on a controller. So you still want to know that. We could either add a capability for validate, or we could introduce the idea of, service level capabilities. Like this has a controller service or it doesn't have a controller service. That kind of opens the door for adding other types of services down the road if we need to. But I don't know if we want to take that step yet.
I think we implicitly do that by doing the second bullet point that G added.
Yeah.
Basically, we're adding a global plugin capability. Inside it, we're going to add a controller service capability. And then in the future, if we want to extend it with new services, it would just be an additional capability there.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that answers my question then. Yeah.
So I think the third bullet point was around what was that call called?
So don't we also need a node service capability? I mean, so for example, in the case of raw block storage, I'm running an Amazon and I want to attach EBS to my node. Do we need anything on that? We don't need a plugin on the node for that, right?
We do, in order to do the last mile mounting.
Oh, right, because it has to be put someplace.
Yep.
It has to be bind mounted into a place. All right, so never mind.
So if we have a capability that says, we support the controller service or whatever, how are we supposed to use that? It's like, oh, great, you have a controller service. Where do I go for that? This comes up to...
The rest of that is defined in the spec in terms of just what are the methods that are available in capability, and what is the life cycle for each one of those methods is defined for each one of the controller calls. So as a CO, what you would have to do is be able to support both node and controller, be able to disable the controller path if this capability is disabled. If it is enabled, then just follow the normal controller path that you would follow. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think the only possible diagram change we need to do is, I think there's a diagram about pre-existing volume in the spec, and if controller service is not present, then the CO should not call validate volume capabilities because
right.
controller service is not implemented. So we might need to change that diagram, depends on that. But the rest sounds like the same.
And presumably, I don't know if it goes without saying that probe controller, which is a mandatory method, wouldn't be mandatory if there's no controller service.
Oh yeah.
So there's another issue opened up about clarifying what the purpose of probe controller is. Kubernetes doesn't actually implement it right now. And before we go and implement it, we wanted to get clarification around it. Maybe we could deal with that as another issue to talk about today. I'll find the issue.
Yeah, do you have a link?
Yeah, hang on, I'll pull it up.
So why are we making validate volume capabilities optional? Why not just keep it as required for controller service and just make controller service optional?
Yeah, I think the third bullet sounds like we should just do the second one is sufficient.
Yeah, yeah, I'm okay with that as well. So make volume capabilities required only for controller service.
I mean, can we just delete that third bullet point because it's already required? So.
Yeah, that's fine with me. I just wanted to make sure it's clear because it was one of the open questions in that issue.
Okay. Sorry, I mean to be pedantic.
No. Okay, so if we're done with that, we can move on to this probe controller thing.
Sure.
Yeah, I think we are done.
Okay, so I guess the questions that we had around probe was, what is the purpose of the probe call? If I remember correctly, there was a couple of use cases that we were considering when we first introduced this. One was to ensure that the dependencies that a volume plugin has, things like mount utilities, et cetera, are all present, or maybe kernel modules are all present on the system. And the second was potentially some sort of health monitoring. So let's ignore that second use case and discuss that first use case. So the first use case was it has all the dependencies it needs. Now the weird thing here is that if that is the purpose of this probe call, it's strange to require the caller to call it, right? This should be an implicit step of the startup of the controller itself, or the plugin itself. When the plugin starts, the first thing it should do is validate whether it has all the dependencies it needs on the underlying system. If it does not, it goes into some unhealthy state, and then as soon as it gets hit with any call, it should reply with an error. The second use case, which is around health monitoring, is a little bit more interesting. Health monitoring is very cool from the perspective of an individual volume, but I'm not sure it makes sense from a plugin level. Like, the health of a plugin itself shouldn't really modulate very much, and you discover that it is unhealthy every time you make a call. And having to make out-of-band calls to discover the health is a little odd, because if you call, for example, probe, and the plugin says it's healthy, and then you call the next call, suddenly it could be unhealthy. So to have an explicit call to check health the check health of the plugin doesn't make sense to me. Having a call that makes that checks the health of a volume might be cool, but we can consider that at a later point. I guess basically at this point I'm questioning why even have a probe call at all.
So Sad, so go back to the first argument that
Yes.
you made. I'm wondering, like, so you're arguing like if the plugin itself is not ready, or it's not like missing some dependencies,
Yep.
or this fail itself. And how does the CO discover that the fact that the plugin missing some dependencies?
So one of two ways. One is a deployment issue, and two is a post-deployment issue. So, for example, when you deploy a volume plugin, if it's unhealthy, it can basically exit with an error code, and basically your plugin is going to refuse to come up, right? So now, as the deployer of the volume plugin, I'm going to be able to see, oh, I'm trying to deploy this plugin, but it's failing because it's saying that. I'm going to go look at the logs for the volume plugin I'm trying to deploy, and it says, oh, I'm missing a kernel module that is required.
Yeah, but how do you distinguish, if you just use error code or like exit status, how do you distinguish between like this like a transient error versus like it's
right.
an error?
So I think in my head, the anything that is critical for a volume plugin to start, to initialize, it needs to check those things at initialization time, and fail initialization, meaning exit with an error code if it doesn't fulfill those. So then there's a second set of things which are transient issues. For example, I'm able to start the volume plugin, all the dependencies are there, but I have a transient network issue. I can't talk to the control plane. Those are issues that should return you should return an error code for a particular gRPC call when you get probed. Right?
So what if there's a bug in the plugin? What if there's a bug in the plugin that just crashes itself, and it's not like some bug that has to be fixed? It's, for example, it's a race condition, so it doesn't prevent the plugin from functioning. Just sometimes it crashes, like how do we distinguish these two cases? And sounds like
So I think the thing here we need to clarify is let's not mix up deployment, monitoring, and all these things for the volume plugin with the interface itself, right? That is the responsibility of how you deploy a volume plugin, how you ensure that it remains up. All those things are external to this interface, right? This interface is assuming that I have a endpoint that is up and running. How do I interact with it? So that problem of a plugin, going into a crashing or going into a crash loop should be the problem of the mechanism that you're using to deploy that volume plugin on that CO. Think of it as any other application where when you deploy an application, let's say it's some sort of web service, the fact that it is available should be decoupled from I guess the data path, the interface that it's exposing.
Yeah, I'm still trying to understand your argument, but let's use.
Actually, you know what? Now I'm second guessing my argument here, because in order to have an effective health monitor, you should have a hook into the application layer to validate its capabilities. So now that I think about it, what I really should be doing is on the Kubernetes side, anybody who deploys a volume plugin should hook that volume plugin into the health monitoring system. Okay, I actually withdraw my argument here. I think it's just how it should be used needs to be clarified, and I think I just thought of how it should be used.
Yeah, to me, I think like it's a difference between like let's say you start a plugin, and then if we don't have any prop call, and the only way you can find out that you missed some dependency is by either looking at, like, I don't know how to do that. In fact, like I don't have a way to like 100% tell there's a missing dependency for my plugin versus just like some issues or some race condition bugs or crashes in my plugin.
But I don't think this call solves that, right?
At the very least, I don't. Well, it does not solve.
I think it's supposed to, or at least it wants to, right? Like it's supposed to be able to detect.
So let me walk through the epiphany that I just had, which was this call is not strictly required. The utility that it has is to plug into the CO's health monitoring system. So for example, in Kubernetes, we have a liveness and readiness probe, which can be exposed by any arbitrary pod. And so the deployment mechanism for a particular volume plugin can say that the liveness probe for Kubernetes should monitor this endpoint when it does a deployment. And so Kubernetes knows I need to probe this particular call in order to ensure that this particular tool is ready. And if at any point this call starts to return an unhealthy signal, that is an indication to me that this pod is unhealthy and that I should do something to try to rectify that. Right? It's not necessarily like there's a difference between this call and the other calls in that this call will be used by the deployment mechanism, whereas the other calls are going to be used by the Kubernetes system itself to try to make things happen.
So to me, that sounds like an abuse of this plugin, actually. Because I guess the way I interpreted this plugin was, this is the plugin we call to see if But this is the RPC we call to see if this plugin's open for business, right? So I have say my controller might be out there running on the internet, right?
Yeah.
If it is unable to reach whatever service it needs to reach, like again, going back to the AWS case, or like if it can't talk to the AWS endpoints because of network segmentation or what have you, then it's going to return like no.
Yeah.
It's going to return an error for this. That doesn't mean that the plugin is not properly running or deployed.
Right.
It just means it doesn't have at this moment what it needs in order to do business. But I don't know. Is that interesting?
Yeah, I think like from our side, like Meso side, I think definitely, because if we call probe and the following tells us is like it's not functioning, the services provide is not functioning, then the Mesos will do proper things like rescind the offers to make sure that those resources are not getting sent to those frameworks that wants to use the resource from this plugin. Things like this, we definitely need that call to make those decisions.
And yeah, I would even add on like if I do something like try to create a volume or whatever on the plugin, and I get an error that's like not one of the registered errors, I can either just implicitly just keep on going, or I could just implicitly say, well, there's a problem with this plugin, I'm not going to call it anymore, or not going to list it, or whatever. Or you can call the capabilities thing, say, hey, or not what are we talking about? The probe, and say, hey, are you working?
I think it depends on how you use the probe. If you're going to use the probe to make sure that you take action to fix the deployed volume plugin, then this makes sense. If you're going to use this to clean up things on your end because the volume plugin is unhealthy, seems a little bit odd to me.
Well, it can also maybe instead of returning the error that I got on the request, I can do the probe controller or probe, whatever the endpoint is called, and I can see, this is having a problem here. I might adjust my error message or change what I'm doing based on if it's actually expected to be working or not.
I think that's the changing of my normal behavior because of this call is a little weird to me because like Julian said, as soon as you call this, like a second later, something bad could happen, right? And so whatever you were going to do in the unhappy case, you're not going to do that. You're going to do the happy case, and it's unhealthy. So in that way, your caller application that's depending on this plugin for certain behaviors, it needs to have like generic error handling, and it shouldn't, like, you can't depend on the result of one call to special case the error for another call. That's weird. The only thing this is useful for in my head is for making sure that the deployment mechanism restarts it or recognizes it as unhealthy. Right?
Well, yeah, I think it's also like if some CO decide to do a unified way of deploying those plugins rather than like asking the plugin writers to deploy themselves, then that will be useful. Like you have the CO have a consistent mechanism to do health checking.
Right.
It does also give you a way, something you can call in order to manage race conditions at startup.
Basically, it's a hook for deployment verification.
Yeah, because some CO might choose to do the deployment in a unified way. I think that's what we do. And that
so maybe we should clarify the wording around this to make that more clear, to say that the purpose of this call is for deployment verification, and the caller, the CO can use, or whoever deploys the volume plugin can use this as either a one-time check to verify that the plugin is running, or as a periodic check to ensure that the plugin is healthy and restarted if it's not healthy.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Like clarify the wording on this.
Yeah, so I guess just to toss another use case out there for this, the way that we use the node part of this call in Cloud Foundry is we do periodic checks to make sure that we have the plugins we need in order to run different kinds of volumes across VMs in our deployment. So, and that funnels back into the algorithm that does work placement. So we won't place a job on a VM if it lacks the plugins to start up the volumes that it needs. So that in order to do that, we need something we can call periodically to say, hey, is this plugin actually running and responding to traffic? Now, we could use other RPCs for that, because I mean, we could just call get supported versions over and over again, but probe feels like it's more purpose-built for that. It's not quite the same as restarting, because we wouldn't necessarily, we have different mechanisms to make sure things are running and restart them. But it does give us a way of saying, hey, you shouldn't try to start work over there because that guy's not capable of that kind of mount. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So basically pull it out of the list of plugins that are available for the node during node selection.
Okay, so sounds like
before we close on this, I completely agree with what everybody just said. Second question is whether there should be a controller probe and a node probe, or if this is a call that we can also consolidate into the identity service as just there is a single probe call for the volume plugin, and it should verify whatever mode it's running in, whatever it needs.
I remember that the reason we introduced that is because for split, like you deploy controller plugin, not in the same container or in the same process as the node plugin, and you need a way to ask the controller plugin, are you ready? Are you able to take requests from CO, things like this? I think that's really
yeah. So what I'm thinking is we need to decouple that, right? Basically, the mode that a volume plugin runs in, whether it's controller or node, is essentially an environment variable or some option that's passed in on startup. After that happens, the probe call should just verify. It's saying, hey, are you running based on whatever I told you to run? Do you have everything that you need? I don't think at that point we necessarily need to differentiate between whether you're running as controller or node. We just say, hey, whatever you are you running, and is everything okay?
Yeah.
that sounds reasonable.
That makes sense to me. It'd be cleaner just have a probe method.
Yeah, since we're doing the cleanup with the controller capability stuff anyway, Julian, would it make sense to do that as part of that?
Yeah, I think so.
Sorry, James.
makes perfect sense to me that James should do both of those things. Yes.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to consolidate. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, cool. So I'll put a comment there and reference the other issue.
Yeah, perfect.
All right, thanks a lot.
Sure.
All right, so we have one more. We have 12 minutes. I just want to discuss this. I think this is a PR by David for this additional step for no stage volume and no end stage volume. And I think, Julian, you have some thoughts on this, if I remember correctly. And I had a discussion with David on this too. Now I'm leaning towards, because I'm convinced that in some cases, for example, the iSCSI case where you cannot put the iSCSI initiator inside controller publish, so it has to be happen on a node, and that call is actually you can only do once per node, not once per volume, we can of course asking the plugin to do reference counting and then do the detach when no volume is being referenced. The volume is not referenced by any workload, but it's kind of tedious for every single plugin that wants to do that, to implement that logic. So I'm kind of right now leaning towards just introduce that step. I just want to bring this up, and I thought, like, Julian, you have some thoughts on this. If I remember, like, maybe we can discuss here.
Yeah, so I guess I'm a little bit I think we already discussed this before, and the use case that Saad had presented was more about validating credentials on subsequent use of something that's been mounted, which made sense to me. The reference counting makes less sense to me because essentially we're presenting a whole bunch of different mount points to the plugin, right? Like we'll take the same volume and we'll ask for it with 6 different mount points. So we're not actually asking the plugin to reference count precisely. We're just asking it to remember that there are 6 mount points that have bind mounted this thing, right?
So I think I think like every single plugin needs to do that probably. But I agree with you. It's probably not that big of deal because I think just tracking those mount points and do the detach when there's no mount points associated with the volume.
There's another set of use cases that actually exist beyond just mount. It's things like formatting a volume the first time that you mount it, or something equivalent of a local attach that things like iSCSI or Fiber Channel can use. I think those use cases, they would benefit a lot in simplifying the volume plugin logic if this call existed. And again, it would be optional. So
right.
I mean, it's idempotent, so doesn't the plugin have to deal with multiple calls anyway, potentially?
So that I wanted to clarify. That's the latest feedback I had on this PR is I don't think this call can be idempotent if it serves the purpose that we're trying to make it serve. Because if we require it to be idempotent, then you could just as easily stick whatever logic that you were going to put here into the node publish call, right? At the beginning of every node publish call, do whatever you would do here. If it's idempotent, it wouldn't matter. The place that it actually does matter is when you have logic that is not idempotent that you have to execute once per volume per node. Things like formatting a volume, things like equivalent of a
formatting a volume isn't once per node, right? I mean, wouldn't that be bad? And for that matter, wouldn't you have to deal with what happens when you've lost your node and you're reattaching?
Yeah, so Saad, I don't get that part. I thought this one needs to be idempotent. So I think you can now call no publish before no stage volume is successful, but you can call multiple times like no stage volume, just to make sure the volume.
I was just thinking about the node. The idempotency aspect of it, like right before this meeting. So I haven't fully thought it out yet. But my thoughts were that if a particular, like whatever this call is going to do, let's imagine it's the equivalent of a local attach, or it's a global mount, mounting a device to a global mount point. If that operation is idempotent, then then you could just stick it into as the first operation of the node publish call, right?
Yeah, but the problem is detach actually, I think.
Yes, good point. Yeah. Okay, you're right. You're right. Okay, because it's not necessarily counting on the way in; it's the counting on the way out and knowing when you're supposed to do the cleanup.
Right. Yeah, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I will actually withdraw that feedback about idempotency then. All right, carry on.
Yeah, I think sounds like I think I'm leaning towards just adding this because I think it will simplify the plugin. For some certain plugin, it will definitely simplify. I think, Julian, you mentioned like authentication authorization, like credential issue. What is that? I don't remember that discussion.
So I thought that was the reason that Saad introduced this PR originally, which was basically it would enable us to mount something onto the node one time that could potentially be reused, and then subsequent calls to node publish come with credentials that we can validate to make sure that the plugin is okay with this workload using this volume. That was, and Saad, please feel free to jump in because I thought this was your use case.
That was not the primary driver behind this. That was, I think you might be thinking about the user credential issue that was opened.
Yeah, I think that might be related because I think like unless you have a like say when you do node stage volume, the credential you use there is per node. The credential might be different than the credential you're going to use for node published volume, which is for each workload. That might be the case. Like the credential you need to do iSCSI initiator is different than the one that you do the mount.
Yeah, that's actually something that we should comment on here. I think he put in a user credential. We should fix that before that goes in to align with what we had for the other fix.
Yeah, I think this also conflict with some other PRs that's in flooding to change the gRPC related like the variable name. So we should, I think we should land the gRPC one first and then replace this one. I think the gRPC one is pretty much like ready to be merged.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Do we need the, in this, what are we calling it, stage and unstaged volume RPC, do we need the staging path as part of the code, or is that something we can get away without having? Because we have a lot of these different paths coming in through the API.
Yeah.
That's one part I don't like this PR is because I think this additional stage path looks like not clean, but I cannot think of a better way to solve that issue.
Well, why does the CO need to provide a staging path? I mean, why couldn't that just be
to prevent collisions mostly? Because if a plugin tries to figure it out on its own, it might pick something that it shouldn't be using.
But couldn't that be resolved just through regular deployment, right? I mean, the plugin could do all kinds of awful stuff if it's started up in a way that is confused with other plugins. But presumably, whoever's starting this plugin on the node is giving it an environment for it to run in safely. So, I mean, at least for us, all of our plugins run with, you know, they get started up and they get told, hey, put all your stuff in this subdirectory.
Yeah, I think Julian, the problem is like the CO is responsible for set the mount propagation properly so that mount will survive the container termination. So if you let the plugin decide where to mount the stage volume, then it's no longer under CO's control, and they might mount the global volume to a location where the CO hasn't set the mount propagation properly.
But wouldn't that be something that, like, I mean, that for starters is very specific to a plugin that's running inside a container, and to me that seems like the onus should be on the framework that's starting that container up to tell the thing that's running inside it, hey, this is where your stuff goes. Right?
Yeah,
we said nothing in this spec about
I could buy that argument. I think what Julian's getting at is, does this strictly need to be passed through the API, or could it be just a deployment parameter? I think the benefit of being through the API is that it's easier to be more programmatic because it's in alignment with where the rest of the paths are generated, versus if it's a deployment parameter, you have to make sure that whoever is deploying it knows how to generate manually the correct path.
I think that also depends on how CO implement this. I think for us, like, we have a kind of a unified way of deploying those plugins, and then we have a predefined location to bind mount to mount the volume that will set the proper like close mount propagation. So yeah, so it really depends on CO implementation. For us, it's like a predetermined location, and we definitely need that stage path. So that's the reason, like, initially I don't like it, but I think I cannot figure out a different way to do that.
Yeah, I guess if we don't have it as a parameter here, then it sounds like the counter argument is mandate something in the spec that says a plugin has to provide a deployment parameter for this so that COs are all on equal footing, and we kind of got away from deployment parameters mandated in the CO.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, ultimately, it feels a little bit like we're hobbling ourselves because we're not standardizing on running plugins in containers and describing what that interface should look like. But but fair enough. I can live with that path getting passed in. I don't have a lot of strong feelings about this RPC anyway.
Wasn't there a
Well, it's optional. So I think like if some COs say, "I don't support this," then I expect that most of the plugin won't even use that if they wants to be cross CO. But anyway, so just one thought.
Didn't someone make a chart somewhere on one of these issues to explain this better? I remember like not liking this, and someone explained it and be like, "Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense," but I don't remember why.
Sorry, Brian, what was the question?
Like I thought somebody had made like a chart somewhere, like detailing the reasoning behind this particular RPC, and I seem to agree with that. But like just in general, like I can't remember why I
I don't remember there is a chart. Anyway,
or some better detailed explanation.
do you guys
Because
know?
David has one like 20 days ago.
I don't remember.
Doesn't ring a bell. This issue's been open for a while, so
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't remember there's a chart somewhere, but it's been there for a long time. All right, sounds good. Anything else? I think we are over time, and I think that's it for today, then. Oh yeah, so I think one last thing. I think the face-to-face got canceled, got delayed. I think that the reason for that is because I think we got some feedback. I think you guys are on the thread, so I'm probably don't repeat that. But I think what I plan to do is I'm going to ask Andrew to start a discussion in the next community sync to define what's the purpose of the face-to-face and what he wants to achieve by having this face-to-face. I think it'd be nice to have that discussion first before we dive into when and where.
Yeah. Meantime, I think I've sort of dropped the ball on the certification stuff. We did do a whole bunch of work to pull in some of the Kubernetes tests, but what I haven't done is to coordinate between the different people writing certification tests. So I'll try to set up
one thing on that
out of band meeting.
I was talking to Luis about it. He's the one who's written what he calls the sanity tests for the CSI drivers on the Kubernetes side. I think as soon as we put the certification label on this thing, it becomes very political and scary, and there is a lot of things that it involves that there's a very high bar for. Instead, what we could do is call this like smoke tests or sanity tests or something.
Sure.
Put them in tree and have them running as, have them built and shipped with every version. And once we get to that point where we're ready to build a certification process, I imagine that these tests will be one part of that. We also have to pass through X, Y, and Z. So if we get rid of the certification validation or the certification label and just call it smoke test or something,
that's fine. I mean, we just followed our own pattern of, and we had some very similar, not very certifying certification tests for Cloud Foundry that we call certification tests. So that's what we ended up calling the new ones. But
got it.
I think people have made a similar point about those tests. So, I don't really have strong feelings about that. Mostly, I just want to get the code, get a single code line in, and it looks like there's some really good stuff in the Kubernetes tree that does most things, but then misses some other configurability that'll make it run against different drivers. So there's a little bit of work to do just to merge things.
I see. So is there a plan to send a PR for the smoke tests for those plugins, send a PR against the in-tree spec repo?
I think that would be part of the work that Julian and Luis and these guys are working on.
Yeah, that's why I think we need a meeting. As long as you guys are okay with having that PR land, I do. The other thing I guess I was thinking was that we could start by just glopping the tests in without any particular guarantees that they run and pass as a step toward locking down, right? Because I think as soon as as soon as they get in there, then there's this question of like, well, do they actually work?
Yeah.
And every time we change the spec, does that mean we also have to go like revamp the test suite?
Yeah, I mean, I think that should become a minimum requirement is every time we modify the spec, you know, CI should break, and we should be required to go in and fix the test every time we modify the spec.
Right. So I guess there's a question of like, do we want to make that requirement immediately? Or do we want to, like, we're talking about some fairly big changes still in the spec, like moving RPCs
Honestly,
around.
I would be okay waiting post 0.2 for this, just because it is a large amount of work and there's a lot of flux going on between 0.1 and 0.2. And if you get anything merged right now, it is most likely going to be broken within a matter of weeks.
So I guess what I was proposing was let's move the tests in tree, but put a fat disclaimer at the top saying
they're currently broken.
These are under development.
Yeah.
We make no guarantees that they represent the current state of the spec.
Yeah.
And then post 0.2, we could lift that.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's reasonable.
I think that sounds like a great idea. Yeah, we should do that. I think like my only worry is like the further we delay this, the further diverge we're gonna have for those toolings, and then it's not good for the community. Like let's just get something into the repo now. Don't say anything about that thing. Just say it might break, and then try to fix that after 0.2.
Okay, great. Sounds perfect. So I'll try and schedule a meeting, and I'll invite all, and you can feel free to not come.
Yeah, I think like I would say like send an email to mailing list, community mailing list. So if anyone is interested, like let them join the meeting, just for the sake of transparency and.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys. See you guys next week.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Great, thanks.
Bye.